I'm General Sheridan. I'm in charge of the military division of the Missouri River. My actual office is in Chicago, but President Ulysses S. Grant appointed me this position. And so I'm in charge of this group. It includes Illinois, Arkansas, Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, and parts of northern Texas and Oklahoma. This area there's a lot of Indian people in this area, and they have been put on the reservation, most of them in 1868, but they don't always stay there. So I've been sent here with my armies all over this country to keep the Indian on the reservation and keep them from, killing the settlers and so forth. But we've had a lot of hard time doing it. There's 96 Indian tribes in this area that I'm in charge of. I've got 17,000 soldiers. So it's pretty hard to keep track of this whole country. This here is General Sheridan's headquarters, and we've chased it around a while. It was out at Fort Reno and got moved into El Reno back in 1954. And we finally got a hold of it and moved it down here, trying to preserve it. This is kind of an unusual building because that it's built with picket style, which is up and down rather than horizontal. Most log cabins or cabins of this type were built, laying down. But in this part of the country, there wasn't enough timber that was long enough to make the long cut, so they made a picket style up and down. And these, they found a grove up here west of Concho of post oak, which is a pretty straight timber, but they're not real long. The blackjack timber in this country there's some here, but it's awful crooked, so we had to use post oak in the construction of this. And this building, the best we can figure, was built in 1875. The Fort Reno was started in 1874, and they camped in there in tents. But pretty quick they built this building for General Sheridan. General Sheridan was command of the Army of the Missouri, and this was part of that army, and so they built this cabin for him, and they dug down in the ground about 2.5 feet and put these poles in the ground, and then made it solid all the way around. Had a dirt floor in it, and it was a dirt floor until 1954, when it was out at Fort Reno on the original site at that time, and they decided they wanted to get it out of there and move it, tear it down, burn it or something. But the city of El Reno, the Chamber of Commerce, got together and decided to try to save it, and so they had 1 weekend to do this. So they took and moved this thing down here in the edge of Adams Park, and it sat there for years, and the city of El Reno took pretty good care of it to start with, and then finally kind of let it go. And I run across it one day and decided that we needed to save this building because it's one of the oldest buildings still standing in western Oklahoma. It may be the oldest log cabin still standing, and it needs to be preserved. A lot of history here. This is a picture of General Sheridan's headquarters when it was at Fort Reno. It was on the southwest side of the parade ground, and you can see that it was dug in. The picket poles, the logs on it were dug into the ground, and it had a dirt floor. And then it was moved, of course, to El Reno. This is a picture over here of General Jesse L. Reno. And that's who Fort Reno is named after. He got killed during the Civil War. They said if he hadn't got killed and went through the Civil War, he'd probably become the President of the United States. He's a very popular person, but he got killed down in the Civil War in 1864. That's a picture. That's what Fort Reno was named after. This is a picture of Ben Clark and his wife, Mo Kay. Ben Clark was probably one of the greatest scouts in the West. He scouted for General Crook and General Scully and General Miles and General Sheridan and General Sherman. And he was scout for General Custer. And he was stationed at Fort Reno from 1875 to 1914, whenever he passed away. He had a wife, Kay, and he had 11 children. And 5 of the children are buried out here in this cemetery, and he's buried there with his wife. And then this is a picture of General Sheridan. General Sheridan was not a very big person. He was kind of short and stocky, but he was a tough little general. Him and Sherman, whenever they went into battle, they didn't take any prisoners if they could keep from it. In other words, they annihilated the Indian people that they'd come across. They figured that was the only way they could conquer the West. So that was kind of the thing that he got. And General Custer was very similar. This is pictures of soldiers in World War I trained at Fort Reno, and shows some of the buildings in the background. This is a Sibley stove that they used to use in the early Indian wars, and they carried with them. This stove was called a Sibley. You put firewood in there. This was your damper. You could open and close it to let air in. They was used in tents. They had a pipe going out. It's a rare little stove that they shaped like an ice cream cone, and it made it easy to carry them in the wagon because you could stack them up instead of a square one around one. This stove here is a cast iron stove that was used in buildings when they started building buildings and barracks, and it was stoked with wood, coal if you could find it, but we didn't have no coal in this country, so you had to cut the wood. There wasn't very little wood in this country. There's a lot more trees today than there were back in the 70s. The river down here's got a lot of timber on it. Back in 1875 when they come, there was very few trees on the river, not hardly any, just very few. In fact, in the old pictures you'd see a little old tree once in a while. The people that was there, the Indian people and the soldiers, used all the wood that they could find. So wood was a very scarce item. Buffalo chips were pretty prevalent, so they picked them up and used them. Of course, buffalo chips is what the buffalo got rid of when they got dry. They made a pretty good fire. It's kind of like charcoal, and maybe flavored the meat some too, probably. All right, here's the telephone that was used in the old feed mill out at Fort Reno. The first telephone in the whole state of Oklahoma was put in at Fort Reno to Darlington, which is across the river about 1.5 miles. That's the first telephone in the whole state of Oklahoma. And then, of course, Fort Reno is started in 1874, and they mainly raised horses. They was put out there to keep the Indian people on the reservation. They were already on the reservation, but they were put on. They raised a lot of horses. They played polo. They loved to play polo, and they had some of the finest polo horses in the world. And so these are some of the bridles, and here's pictures of mules. They had mules and horses. At one time, they had 20,000 horses and mules at Fort Reno. So this is a picture of some of the mule pastures that you see. There was 10,000 acres in Fort Reno. Another thing that they done, they watched the line whenever they had the run of 89. The soldiers had to keep the Sooners out of the run area. So this is a picture getting ready for the run. Here's some more pictures of the fort and some of the getting ready for the run. This is a picture of the run of 1889. They had a run of 1889, started right here. Right out here in this street. We're about 50 foot from the line. And it was in 1889. They had another run in 1892. And another run in 1893. And in 1894 and one in 1895. They were lesser runs, but that's what they had. And the land drawing in 1901. These are homemade fly traps. Flies were terribly bad. So they made this fly trap. It's got a screen on the outside. And they put a pan of molasses underneath. When a fly would fly up, he couldn't find his way out. He would never fly down and come out of there, so he'd end up dying in there. That was just a little thing that they had. These are some of the irons that they used out there, and they had a lot of branding iron. This is one of the typical rifles that the military used back after the Civil War. This rifle is a Sharps. It's a 50-70, and this is what we first come west with. And this is what they call a sling, and you had it around your shoulder and down here and on horseback, and that sling is on a swivel, and it comes up this belt, gives you a chance to aim that thing, got you, and then let it go, and you don't lose it. But anything else that you'd have holding on, you couldn't bring it up and see how it slides up this belt. So you can use it, bring it down, reload it, or drop it. You still got it with you. So that was a sling that they used. They used them in the Civil War, toward the end of the Civil War. And they used them in the Indian Wars. They sometimes carried a saber, which was used on a belt. It rattled a lot, and it was kind of hard to use, saber, and the soldiers hated the darn thing, and they very seldom used it in a charge. Once in a while they'd pull it out and use it or show it. And generally it was pretty shiny, and it was used mainly to intimidate the enemy or the Indian people. There's only been one instance where they had a saber charge against the Indian people. Most of the time it was a charge with pistols or rifles, but they did have the saber, and they sometimes carried it in the field with them. Generally, it ended up in the wagon or somewhere else, because you didn't get close enough to an Indian to touch you with a saber. You had to have a pistol or you had to have a rifle. They branded their horses with a branding iron, with a USA, and they branded all their horses and all their mules. So if somebody stole one of them, they knew it belonged to the military, and that was against the law, and sometimes a hanging offense. So anyway, they had a lot of horses and a lot of mules, and Fort Reno became a remount station in later years. Closed down in 1946. The soldiers all carried a 6-gun, and it was a .45 caliber Colt pistol with a 7.5-inch barrel. And it was 6 shots, and this is what they carried. And they carried it in the scabbard, turned backwards, like that, rims like they did in the Civil War. And one reason they carried it this way is because they could reach across when you're sitting in the saddle and pull it out. If it's turned the other way, it's kind of hard to get it out of the scabbard, so you took it out, that away. But it's a .45 caliber Colt single action pistol, and that's what they carried as a sidearm, which is a very good sidearm, and one of the great inventions of Sam Colt. We talked about the weapons. They used a carbine, and occasionally they used a saber. But during the Civil War, nearly every soldier carried a knife, because if he run out of shells or his weapon quit working, he still had a chance. And during the Civil War, a lot of your battles were very close up. But the Indian Wars is different. You didn't seldom get close enough to an Indian to touch him. And if you did, it was too late. But he carried near